My name is Linda Lees. I am the Director of Cultural Programming and Special Projects for TEFAF New York. Very pleased to have you all here. I want to give you just a couple of pieces of housekeeping, and then I'll introduce our moderator. This panel is being live streamed on Facebook. It will be on Facebook for about a week or so until it's edited, and then it will go up onto the website permanently. So you can access this again, tell your friends about it, your colleagues. And in addition, we have every panel that we've ever done since fall of 2016, which we consider a great educational resource. We take all these programs extremely seriously so that we are sure to have not only fun and some entertaining witticisms, but a high level of intellectual rigor. This is a topic, I just have to give a little plug to something we did last fall. The areas of interest for me around World War I are almost limitless. I wrote my own dissertation around this period. Last fall, we did a panel called Great War, Great Art, talking about what the effect of World War I was on artists as we were looking at the centenary of the end of World War I. The opportunity then to do a panel again around that same period was really exciting for me. And the people at Bard Graduate Center kindly, in the 11th hour, so to speak, put together this terrific panel. This is set against the background of their exhibition, which I highly recommend, named French Fashion, Women, and the First World War. It's at the Bard Graduate Center, and it runs until January 5th. Okay, I'm now going to introduce our moderator, Lourdes Font, Associate Professor, History of Art, and MA Program Director, Fashion and Textile Studies at the Fashion Institute of Technology, known to most of us as FIT. Lourdes.
Thank you, Linda. And thank you all for coming. Our panelists today all have close connections to the exhibition. So we'll start by introducing them, beginning with Emma at the far end. Emma Cormack is the assistant curator for this exhibition at the Bard Graduate Center. Sarah Scaturro is the head conservator at the Costume Institute of the Metropolitan Museum, which is one of the lenders to the exhibition, and she's also a doctoral candidate at the Bard Graduate Center. And Michele Majer is a professor at the Bard Graduate Center and of fashion history, and she is a contributor to the catalog, which you see here, French Fashion, Women, and the First World War, which is a wonderful resource for fashion historians. And this is a period that they haven't spent much time looking at until a few years ago, to mark the centenary of the beginning of World War I. There began a series of conferences, exhibitions, and books. This is now the latest one that encouraged fashion historians to take a look at this period that turns out to be very interesting and very important. So we want to start by taking a look at what fashion was like, centered in women's fashion, is always centered in Paris, immediately before the war began. How can we describe what we see here? So I'll ask some panelists to throw out some words that maybe are appropriate for describing the state of fashion at the start of the war.
Well, it's still, we're at the very tail end of the Belle Epoque. Women are still corseted, heavily corseted. Corset, we'll see, because Lourdes has some, I know what the slides are coming up. Some images of the corsetry that creates that silhouette. Right. But it's still fairly rigid in terms of the body. It has started to slim down around 1910. But you can see there's a lot going on, right, in terms of yes. the overall ornamentation and construction of the garments.
Would you agree?
Yeah, as well as the length of the skirts and kind of the way that the skirts are coming in at the bottom, slightly restricting some sort of walking capability. You're not taking long strides in these skirts.
And these are actually the two images that we used to open the exhibition at Bard Graduate Center. So we have these two pre-war images paired with two post-war images taken by the same photographers, the Berger Frères. And they were sort of the precursor to street style photographers. And so we paired these images together to sort of show how all of these accessories and all of the trimmings, each of the women, you can see they're wearing hats and coats and scarves and vests, and when you look at them alongside the post-war images, you can see that, like Michele and Sarah said, that the silhouettes are really pared down throughout the war and sort of much less ostentatious.
And one of the wonderful things about these photos is, for the first time, we're really starting to see street style in action. And so the Berger Frères, we actually have some of their archives at the Met in our library. So if you are interested, you can also visit them and actually look at them. And they're really beautiful.
Right. I think it's important to understand the context of these photographs that at the time would have appeared in newspapers and the fashion media, and that they do record fashion as actually worn, but many times the Berger brothers would go to places where they knew that they would find fashionable people, like the racetrack in the afternoon and other places like that. And if you notice that some of these women look very, very practiced at posing, they're almost like red carpet poses. It could be that they are used to being photographed, and that is the sort of the part of their lifestyle, but also that some of them may have been professional models from the couture houses who would be sent to these places where fashionable people congregated in order to be photographed, in order to promote the work of a particular couturier. So we have to, we look at these and we wonder, but at least what they capture is real, what was really worn at the time. And I think in addition to noting that the accessories are very fussy and they're there both in terms of quantity and size, that there doesn't seem to be much agreement about basic proportions. Where should my waistline be? How long should my hemline be? Fashion hasn't made up its mind in 1914. There seems to be a lot of uncertainty about basic things, like proportions. But let's take a look, as promised, at what is going on underneath. Here's a corset from 1912. You're still using the word corset.
Yeah.
Is it? How would you describe it as compared to, say, a corset 10 years earlier?
Well, the corsets 10 years earlier really utilized steel to get a lot of the shaping, and to achieve that S-line shape, the sinewy shape where you had the kind of pigeon breasts and the very tight waist, and your buttocks were kind of poofing out in the back. And so this is a very, very different, this is almost what you would see in the 20s,
Yeah.
going into this very straight, boyish figure.
Yeah, it's longer. It's trying to streamline and straighten the body.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's coming down over the hips,
Yeah.
which the earlier S-shaped corset did not. That
Right.
really focused more, it came to the top of the hips, but not down over the hips themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So you are getting this sort of compression of the body as you go into the teens and into the 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And the chemise at the far end is very simple, very straight. So women also wore pantalettes still at this time, but by the war's end, those would be gone. So just as you've seen with the silhouette on the exterior, on the interior, it was still very transitional, but going in the tendency of straightening out and smoothing and slenderizing the body, and hence the need. We see more and more ads like the one on the right.
And eliminating undergarments, I mean, from, say, 1900.
Right. And working to shape the body from within through diet and exercise, as opposed to relying upon a corset to give you the fashionable shape. So the long 20th century sort of story of the diet industry, the weight loss industry, that we see it's already going strong in the media of this time.
And combined with exercise, I mean, that
Yeah.
women in sport is a huge phenomenon at this time from the late 19th century onwards, that women are participating more in more active sports. So not just horseback riding, which they had done for centuries, but golf, swimming, tennis, you know, much more
Yeah.
active in terms of their movement in these various sports. So, so the body ideal was also changing.
Yeah.
From, say, 1900 as you go into the 20s.
And then the war begins. So immediately, there's certain things that happen. I think this story is from Vogue. This correspondent, Anne Rittenhouse, not her real name, but she also wrote for the New York Times. And she went around to the couture houses and saw that many of them were closed, at least temporarily. The ones that were headed by male couturiers were particularly hard-pressed to keep their doors open because the couturiers were mobilized to join their regiments and go off to war. So that's what happened with Paul Poiret. So that was one of the first effects, is that the industry is kind of caught not knowing how is this going to affect them, and will they even be able to continue operating, especially to serve their international clientele. So in terms of how the Paris couture industry responds is with uncertainty, panic. Even some of the couture houses that were international, that even had German or Austrian founders, were taking down the names of their founders from their doors, and some of them later on were actually shut down by the government.
Yeah, in the catalog, I think it's both in the introduction, but probably elsewhere, Maud talks about the disbanding of the Chambre Syndicale in, I guess, later 1914 to eliminate non-French-born couturiers. And then it's reorganized in 1915, and only French-born couturiers and couturières are allowed in this new Chambre Syndicale.
So it was a huge disruption.
Right.
And because the war began in August, there were a number of buyers, international buyers, that were scheduled to be there anyway for the showing of the fall collections. And so there was confusion for them as well. And after this declaration of war, many of them no longer returned. You know, there were a much, much smaller number of international buyers would try to go to Paris, as had been their practice.
And in the first few weeks of the war, the government mandated the closure of theaters and cinemas and music halls. But because the fashion industry was the second largest economic sector at the time, they really couldn't afford to shut down all the couture houses. So the designers ended up showing their collections, like you said, to a smaller number of buyers in the city. And designers like Poiret and Worth were mobilized and sent to the front.
Yeah. Here are some examples of where we're trying to address here is how did women's lives change immediately? That they found themselves doing things they would never have done were it not for the war. So munitions workers are one example. But also taking over, there was a French word, les remplaçants, right? Can you talk about what that meant?
Sure. So during the war, the number of women working didn't increase a huge amount, but the jobs that they were doing really did change quite a bit from the pre-war positions they held. When the men were called to the front, there were lots of jobs left open that needed to be done, such as these women here. On the left, she's an omnibus conductor and a delivery woman for the department stores. So they fulfilled these roles, including working for the gas company, at the train stations, post women, really sort of things that helped kept the city going while the men were away. And these new roles necessitated new types of workwear. So these two women here probably could have worn things that they owned already, including these tailored skirt suits, but for the women working in munitions factories or more dangerous jobs, for example, chimney sweeps, or as longshoremen, they needed proper work attire that would enable them to do these sort of dangerous jobs safely and effectively.
So these long aprons over overalls is something that, woman normally was not in a woman's wardrobe at all. But then these skirt suits, as compared to, I think there were a pair of skirt suits in the pre-war photographs that we were looking at. Do you see any changes in the silhouette of these suits?
Well, we can see much more of their legs.
Yeah.
And all their little boots that they're wearing. The skirts are much fuller. There is less frou-frou or applied decoration going on. And it's basically the crinoline de guerre, or the silhouette, the bell shape that comes in just at the outbreak of the war.
Right, so these full skirts, the fashion media gave it the name crinoline, going back to, echoes of the 19th century, very, very full skirts. But in the cases of these tailored suits, I don't know that they're reminding us too much of the 19th century, because we've never seen such short skirts in the whole history of fashion. That has to be the thing that people were really struck by at the time. To suddenly see so much of a woman's leg. And of course they are covered up with these high boots, but still, it's a different proportion. And they seem to have made up their minds as to where their waistlines are. So a lot of the decoration, a lot of the accessories, it's almost as if they're saying, we don't have time for that nonsense now. So not only are they in different roles, but these are practical clothes to perform those roles in. I like these shoulder bags as well. Okay.
Yeah, we noticed that a lot of the materials, as you can see, are wool or stodgy or thicker materials. And so we actually, in a museum collection, you're more likely to find these kind of stodgier, simplistic woolen garments than you are going to see the garments right before, which are made from a variety of different materials like chiffon, lamaze, satins that just are literally, at this point, powdering and no longer extant.
Right, so very delicate materials that you see a lot of during the first, just before the war, not so much once the war begins.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's an example of an actual uniform. So maybe Emma can tell us about this particular uniform and the woman that wore it?
Yes, this is one of my favorite pieces in the exhibition. This was worn by a woman named Marjorie Carr. She was a member of the Smith College Women's Relief Unit that went to France during the war and worked. Her nickname was Pidge, and she's in the photo on the right, just in the center of the middle row, wearing her uniform. And Smith College has an amazing archive of her letters and her journals that she kept while she was there. And these women went to France to help build schools and to help feed the French people who lived in the area that they were stationed. And they drove cars, they built buildings, they were stationed very close to the front lines, and it was a very difficult job that they were doing. And so they needed, like you said, these sturdy utilitarian work uniforms to do their job well.
And the shorter hemlines helped them to climb in and out of cars and to be able to drive cars and so on.
Maybe can I just point out, because I think we'll probably get to it in other images, but the close resemblance between the uniform, this particular uniform, and uniforms in general, to what the French call the tailleur pratique or the tailleur classique. So very simple in its lines, very minimal ornamentation, and also the inclusion of actual functioning pockets, which makes sense for a uniform, but is also very much an aspect of fashionable dress during this period, and it's promoted as such, that you need to have pockets either in the skirt of the, yes, in the skirt itself or on the jacket, and that they're not necessarily, I mean, they're very evident on the suit.
Right, and they had not really been much of a feature of women's fashion before. It was always men that had practical pockets at various places on their attire, but women could not count upon that.
And certainly not on an exterior garment this way.
Right.
I mean, they would have had sort of concealed pockets in their skirts, but not really functional pockets on an outdoor or an outer garment.
Right.
And that's a really interesting sort of trickle-up effect. Normally, designs for couture would sort of trickle down and affect all sorts of silhouettes that women of all classes would wear. But in this case, the workwear really sort of trickled up and influenced designers like Paquin. And like Michele said, you see these large functional, but sometimes not functional pockets.
So I guess that's what we want to get at here, is about the relationship between the uniforms and the skirt suits that begin to look more like uniforms, and the relationship between uniforms and fashion. So what do you think about that?
So the French government didn't provide its women working for in the war efforts with uniforms. So there was this tension at the time. French women were working toward the right to vote, and the government thought that giving them these sort of official uniforms would give them a good basis to demand the right to vote. And so women like this, the woman who wore this suit on the left, she was an upper-class wealthy woman who owned a car that she used as an ambulance during the war. And in order to successfully pass roadside checks, etc., she had to go to her tailor because the French government wouldn't give her a uniform. She went to her tailor and asked them to make this sort of uniform-looking tailored suit.
Okay.
And the color too, maybe. I mean, it's sort of that bluey
Gray
gray.
flannel, yeah.
It's not so dissimilar to what the infantrymen wore, right? I mean, that bleu soldat or whatever.
And of course, the white of the nurses' uniforms. So many women involved in nursing. So that was a ubiquitous sight in public, in the streets, and to see nurses. And some of them were really not very extensively trained, but they took on nurses' uniforms anyway, and it became the sort of the thing to do in the look of, as well as, of course, being very serious. So here's an actual nurse's uniform that's in the exhibition, and the cape and headgear. Can you talk more about this?
Sure. This uniform on the right here is an example of a full uniform with the overcloak, the apron, the dress, the underskirt, and the veil. This was worn by a woman named Sidonie Poquet, who was 26 when she became a nurse working during the war. And both of these nurses' uniforms are from the Musée de la Grande Guerre in Meaux, France. And they have a really amazing collection of World War I materials that we have a lot of in the exhibition.
And I don't know, Lourdes, maybe I can just insert here again, because I was rereading the intro and the conclusion of this book in the last couple of days, that the discussion around the tension throughout the war period in terms of what women were wearing, whether it was fashionable dress or whether it was dress for work, including uniforms, and nurses' uniforms. And Emma, maybe you know better in terms of I don't necessarily know what the demographic was for women who became nurses during World War I, French women, but I think that Maud talks about the fact that there were, I mean, it was something that certainly upper class women could do, who had a certain leisure, that they could go out and offer to become a nurse or to work as a nurse. But there was criticism that they were trying to make themselves attractive to the men who they were taking care of by these uniforms that they were wearing, these beautiful white uniforms or whatever. So either way, I mean, there was this fine line that they had to tread throughout the war period in terms of what they were wearing.
And I remember hearing conference.
And Mourning, too, was another one.
Hearing some papers about the tension between the nurses who had extensive medical training, graduated from nursing schools, and for whom the details of the uniform were very significant in terms of representing their credentials and their various institutions that they were affiliated with. And that instead these sort of socialite nurses would come in and not respect the meaning, the symbolic meaning of some of the details of nurses' uniforms. Everyone wanted to, or there was certainly a lot of social pressure to volunteer, to do something. But the serious professional nurses were somewhat put off by this sudden influx of faux nurses, if you will, or nurses' aides.
Can I also just add here that, I mean, one of the books that I think we might recommend, not in terms of the French perspective of World War I, but in Britain, Vera Britton's book, Testament of Youth. She became a nurse. She was from an upper middle class. But I think there's also a lot of anxiety on the part of men about young women having access to men's bodies. So that was also part of it, which they would never have had before, certainly not.
And being so vulnerable.
And being so vulnerable, and that, this idea that the soldiers would fall in love with the nurse, but certainly the access to every part of a man's body if he was injured in terms of caretaking. So I think.
One thing about the color, why white, especially if you are dealing with wounded people, and might you not want to wear something that hid dirt a little more, or blood, or that you didn't need to maintain so much. But it was the modern sanitization kind of practice that they were told they had to wear white so that you could see if it was soiled, and making sure that you were holding up to these levels that were required.
So here we see some more skirt suits and a design for one. We've already talked about how they were sturdy, sort of sensible woolen materials. What about what would go underneath? Because maybe if the skirt suit is your new uniform, even if it's not an actual uniform, to stretch out its wear, you could combine it with different kinds of blouses underneath. So before the war, you have a lot of shirtwaist blouses. What happens to that kind of modular way of dressing, a little influenced by menswear, now that the war has started? Does it continue? Does it develop? Like I noticed this one.
Well, it looks like they both have blouses underneath, or they're dressed.
Well, one thing to note about the war crinoline silhouette, these really wide skirts, although they were shorter and might have made certain things easier, I mean, I think this is brought out in the exhibition a lot, is that they actually were very cumbersome and heavy. And so there is a question as to whether they were really this, like, moving towards liberating women, or towards these kind of more comfort. So I think underneath them, you would have had to have worn other additional layers to kind of support this really heavy woolen skirt and get the desired fashionable shape at the time.
Yeah, it's very complicated when we think about this silhouette. We sort of understand why shorter skirts, but why such full skirts during this time? And here we have an example in black, which gives us another thing to talk about. So do you want to just jump in and say something about how can we interpret the wartime crinoline silhouette?
Well, one of the main sort of advantages of the crinoline silhouette was that it used between 4 and 8 meters of fabric, about 26 feet or so. So in the first few months of the war, when France was really struggling, the fact that the French fashion industry was sort of setting this new fashion meant that international clients, seeing that they needed to keep up with the fashion, were purchasing this much fabric and making these new garments, and that really gave them a monetary boost that they needed in the first few sort of chaotic months of the conflict.
And do you think by using the word crinoline, it was somehow reassuring that women would, even though they were playing these unprecedented roles, that they were still feminine in a traditional sort of 19th century way?
Well, again, I think that comes out a lot in the catalog, in particularly in the essays by Maud and Sophie. That
That's Maud Bass-Kruger and Sophie Kirkjian, who are the curators of the exhibition.
that there was a lot of anxiety about about women entering doing kinds of work that formerly had been done by men, or and their increasing presence in the public sphere. And that there was this need to remain feminine, and that the dress, is certainly seen as part of that.
So here we have a different category of attire as well in this crinoline silhouette, because this is not a skirt suit, but a dress that would be worn maybe later in the day and is made out of the more delicate materials, but it's a black dress. So what does this mean? Black certainly has a long history of being used for mourning, but now with so many deaths happening weekly, does the war change the meaning of a black dress?
Absolutely. By the end of the war, I think it was 1 in 3 men who had died. So that left about 600,000 French women widows. And for the first time, they were much younger than widows had been before. And sort of stemming from Victorian mourning practices, in which you undergo several stages of wearing full black, and then black with hints of gray, and black with sort of shiny accessories, and staying out of the public eye for a while you were mourning. The fact that there was a war going on meant that women couldn't stay out of the public eye for 2 years or so. They needed to go out to work. They needed to be keeping the economy going, keeping the city running. And so mourning practices during the war were really shortened. And that also meant that you saw lots of young women in black on the streets in Paris. And this also elicited tension from men, because they felt perhaps that their women were forgetting them. They, aside from being, experiencing the trauma of war, they were worried that their wives, their mothers, their daughters were forgetting them too quickly, and were out on the street in these very fashionable mourning garments.
And advertising that they were...
Advertising that they were available.
They were looking for another husband, possibly.
Yeah.
Well, it was because that's what it
They were young and
signified,
attractive, and
that
they'd been married
they were
before.
no longer had a
Yeah.
husband, and so
Right.
they were...
One of the things with mourning attire that does change, though, is also the materials. So during Victorian mourning, one of the main materials was mourning crepe. It's this very textured, kind of crinkly fabric that is notoriously poor wearing. It breaks easily, it tears easily, it turns orange. And so you start seeing this move towards lessening the use of mourning crepe and allowing the use of maybe just more, again, practical, stodgy or heavier wearing materials.
We also see, oops, sorry. We see black dresses that are not mourning dresses
Yeah.
because they're too colorful. We thought this is a good example. It's familiar. So the little black dress, is it born during this time? Can we use that term during this time? A discreet dress at a time when everyone who's not in gray flannel or blue wool serge or white nurse's uniform or mourning black, that a black dress with a little color is discreet, is right for the times.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of some of the periodicals that I looked at, and I was mostly focusing on the skirt suit, the tailleur.
Right.
But you definitely see a lot of references to just, black dresses that are not mourning dresses for day wear. They're kind of like passe-partout, or, that you,
Right, right.
they go through the day.
Right, that's the point of the practicality of the black dress. Yeah.
And that designers are using that color, and not specifically for mourning dress.
Yeah. And that brings us to questions about the media during this time, because it's not just the functioning of the Paris couture houses, their access to, or rather the access of international buyers to them, but also the media that is, the fashion media that is so Paris dependent, reporting on the Paris collections and so on. How disrupted were they by the war? And some of the luxury publications like the Gazette du Bon Ton struggled to keep going during the war. And I think there went years without publishing, right?
Yeah, I mean, some of the magazines that I looked at, primarily I looked at, I think, L'Art et la Mode, Les Modes, Le Style Parisien, Les Élégances Parisiennes. So some of them definitely suspended publication at some point, for some period of time between 1914 and 1918. Including Les Modes, which stopped completely for the year of 1916 and published one issue in 1917, and they write a note to their subscribers saying, the cost of paper is exorbitant, we can't do this. But then there were the Style Parisien and Les Élégances Parisiennes that were both published by Lucien Vogel.
Right. Who was the publisher also of the Gazette du Bon Ton?
Actually begin during the war.
Yeah.
And one is 1915 to 16, the other is 1916 into the 20s, I forget when it stops. But they were very much, and I mean, this is true of all of them, but particularly those two, they're really propaganda machines for the French fashion industry. And they say that in the beginning. They say, we are here to support the French fashion industry and let everybody know that the French fashion industry is still going, and we're supporting our couturiers, and it's very much vis-a-vis incursions or encroachment from Germany. That the French are worried the Germans are going to somehow take over the fashion industry during the war, and even though they want the American buyers. They want the American buyers to know that they are still viable during the war, and that they have something to offer.
I would say the same is true also for the textile industries, where a lot of the woolen mills were in the north and were, in occupied territories. And so in Lyon, in the traditionally silk centers, they started finding new ways to weave with wool as well. So even though it was a traditionally silken industry, you do see innovations and materials happening at that time.
So, and this image seems to be saying that visually as well, is just that it's fashionable it's patriotic to be fashionable.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a big refrain in these magazines, is that women, and that's also where the tension comes from, is that you need to be fashionable to support the national economy and this luxury industry, but you don't want to be too fashionable, because then the husbands, the fathers, the brothers, will worry that you're not really concerned about them.
We don't want this talk to end without having an opportunity to delve a little deeper into one of the garments that's in the exhibition, this beautiful evening dress by Calo Sir that Sarah actually can tell us a lot about.
When the curators said that they wanted this dress for the exhibition, which it's held in the collection at the Costume Institute, my fellow conservators and I, we took a look at it, and at first we were a little confused because we didn't really know what to make of it. It had obviously been remade at certain points in its life. Here you see a test dress. So we're putting it on the mannequin for the first time after treating it, trying to understand what the heck is going on with this dress. So if you can go back one, what you see is on the left, the recent photograph of it that we took for the catalog. And then on the right, you see it's on the right, is how it appeared in an exhibition in the 70s under the supervision of Diana Vreeland. And so we really just wanted to show that by including it in this exhibition that every object has a life and has a story, and you don't always know what the story is. But as you can see, it was reworked at the bodice and at the neckline, at the waist. The waist has been changed. If you go back, you can see under Diana Vreeland's time, the skirt was changed to kind of be more asymmetrical. The length has been changed. The little tulle flanges going over the shoulders were kind of pinned together at the front in this very interesting way. It has this crazy belt that we looked at it and we're like, this is just not right. And sure enough, we did fiber ID and it was polyester. So of course it's not real. And so it took us a while. So go back to the test dress. Literally, we just were looking and we had the whole, almost the whole Costume Institute was walking in here looking at it going, what the heck is going on with this? And moreover, how do we want to display it in the exhibition? And what we decided through the historical references, do you have the reference photo?
I have
this is the inside,
views.
yeah.
Yeah, the interior.
Yeah, so you can see on the inside, the entire bodice has been taken apart. It's been totally relined. It was shattering. There's a lot of non-original material in it. However, there is a lot of still remaining original material, including that amazing brocade, the pink brocade. And then do you have going forward? Oh, no, okay.
Sorry.
So there was, what we ended up doing is we used reference photos from Calo Sir to try to understand how might it have looked. And what we decided was that the back of the dress is very unresolved, and we don't quite know how it should actually have been seen. And so if you go to visit the exhibition, you'll see this dress and you'll see that the back of the vitrine is beautifully frosted, so you can't actually get a good look because we were really afraid of showing something that was not original. And so we feel quite confident about the front of the dress that it seems resolved, but the back we're still unsure of. So just a little story of a dress. I hope you get to see it. It's really beautiful.
So the record shot doesn't show it from the back.
No. I don't think
Got around the problem.
so. A front view.
Yeah.
So, you can see we've kind of just held up the thing just for the moment, but we don't really know what's going on.
Right. So you have to really excavate, almost like an archaeologist, going through the various layers of materials. Okay, here we see the contrast between the crinoline silhouette with the very full skirts and the silhouette that succeeds it. By 1917, we begin to see it called the barrel silhouette. So what are we to make of the contrast here?
Well, fashion needs to keep changing. It doesn't matter if there's a war, right? You need to change.
So another reason for people, for women to continue to consume is your old, crinoline style dress is old-fashioned. You need to either have your dressmaker remodel it or just go out and get it completely new.
And this required less than 4.5 meters.
Yes, much less fabric. And the other selling point was that it was very difficult to turn your crinoline skirt into a barrel line. So you needed to buy new.
Right. And here's some sketches that show the crinoline silhouette at the far left, and then the barrel line, and then the final silhouette of the wartime period that is there by the end of the war, November 1918, and continues into the 1920s. And it's really not normal or typical for there to be so many fashion silhouettes roughly every year and a half, as you have during World War I. That is not the pace at which fashion normally changes. So when we look at this period and we analyze really what's happening, it's an extraordinary amount of fashion change in a short amount of time. But knowing where we started out and where we're going to end, here we have 3 examples of suits. What can we say about the final silhouette, the final turn that fashion takes? Say from 1918 to we're in the middle of 1918, from barrel to, what could we call this on the right-hand side?
Modern.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does sort of, as you were saying at the beginning, it sort of settles down a bit, and it
Simplifies, pares down,
like
It's not historicized.
straightens out, all the lines are
to the
straight,
20s. Yeah.
very angular. The jacket there is completely straight, the skirt is straight, a little narrow at the bottom. Here's a contrast between just taking one designer before the war and after the war. It's a shift in proportion, but not terribly dramatic change. And another thing that we wanted to make sure to highlight is the dominance of women designers during this period. Perhaps because some of the men found it difficult to run their businesses while also being on active duty, but perhaps because, as in other fields, in fashion, World War I gives women opportunity. So all 3 dresses are in the exhibition.
Yes, we're very lucky to have several examples of beautiful Lanvin dresses. So these 3 dresses open the exhibition, giving viewers sort of a visual timeline of how the silhouette changes over the war. And these Lanvin especially conserved these for us, and they've never been on view in America before. So I hope everyone has a chance to come see them.
Yeah, really beautiful embroidery, especially.
And Lourdes, I don't remember whether you have in here, whether I got to I was just going to talk about the strike of the Midinette. I mean, just in terms of women and women's participation.
Couture house workers, Midinettes.
So they're not. There's the seamstresses who go on strike during the war for better pay. So they're not the women running the couture houses, but there is this visibility of the seamstresses, the women working in the atelier, who demand higher wages and the English work week and so on, and come out onto the streets.
And into child labor, really, which have been
in the thousands. I mean, I forget what the numbers are, Emma, you probably know, but that they prevail in, I think it's the
1917.
So
at the beginning of the war, the Midinettes had accepted lower wages so as to help sort of jumpstart the war effort. And they, by 1917, were fed up that they were sewing these beautiful, luxurious, expensive gowns and still being paid those war wages. So they took to the streets.
And they were successful.
and that is when Paquin, right? Jean Paquin becomes the head of the Chambre Syndicale in 1917. So then I don't know.
Women,
are
at various
very
levels, from the designers to the workers, rise to the fore during the wartime period. And of course, one of the most famous that really emerges during this time is Gabrielle Chanel. Another one is Madeleine Vionnet. She had started her couture house in 1912, closed it at least partly during the wartime period, but then reopened, and is really the dominant designer until the end of her career in 1939. So this dress on the right is also in the exhibition, this Vionnet dress. So we can sort of end with the big picture question of, is this very unusual period on the one hand that is chock full of fashion change and all of this social change that is so important. Is it also the real beginning of modern fashion with a capital M, as I tell my students, for 20th century women, the real beginning of modernism in fashion? Ladies, you want to take a crack at that big question?
Well, Lourdes was my professor, so I would have to say yes. No, could you go back to the Chanel?
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things here, and this is also brought forth in the exhibition and the catalog, and in fact the blouse is in the exhibition. This is a very extremely rare blouse, jersey, silk jersey blouse from the Chanel archives. And although she wasn't quite the first to use jersey, she's often touted to be the first to use jersey, but what were they doing using jersey, which until then was really for, sportswear, underwear, very informal attire. Why were they starting to use jersey of all things? And then if we just pull it forward into athleisure today, and the prevalence of jersey, and what does that mean for comfort and for the body, and yeah.
I think it's really all in her body language in the photograph there. This is the
Amazing.
way that we dress today, that we move today. That slouchy, oversized fit,
certainly
that
couldn't do
comfort.
Yeah.
Yeah, you
Long
couldn't do
line
it.
boned
Right.
corset.
And there's no corset under there, that's for sure. Does anyone have any questions for us, for the panel?
It's 2 minutes.
According to a Chanel biography I read, it was Boy, whatever his name was. Yes, thank you, Boy Capel, who wore the jersey, and she was fascinated with that. And it was menswear, but that's what made her decide to use the jersey. Also, it might have been more affordable in wartime, I'm not sure, because it wasn't a fancy fabric for women at the time.
Silk definitely became more affordable during the war. Like Sarah mentioned, the northern textile factories were bombed by the Germans, so the prices of wool and cotton and linen really soared, and the prices of silk dropped. And that's also interesting that you mentioned that she was looking to his clothing, because Chanel started out as a hat maker, and her clients who purchased her hats really loved the way that she dressed herself and encouraged her to make clothing and sell to them. So that's where we see this sort of effortless, elegant style that she's known for.
We're out of time.
Oh,
Thank
sorry.
you. This wonderful panel. Thank you all for coming. Please make your way over to Bard Graduate Center to see the entire exhibition, and kudos to everyone involved. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.